briefly to your mention before of the sense of the High Cabal as a unit or group of some form originating perhaps more from the Oriental base of historical roots than perhaps the Europe base. You were telling me the other day of the story of the Chinese travelers who went to the Middle East to study the knowledge of the Arabic people, and their whole approach in the way they ran their exploration, and your sense behind that to a degree of the High Cabal perhaps more originating out of the Oriental basis of a cultural basis than the European.
You know, we are so prone to study history in a linear fashion. From the United States, we go back to England, we go back to France and Germany, we go to Rome, we go to Greece, back to the Middle East and Babylon and that sort of thing, and it sort of ends there, as though the world began there. I think if you asked 90 out of 100 Americans where Adam and Eve were born or appeared, they'd say the Middle East, because almost every formal study of history trickles back that way, as though Asia or Russia or Indonesia didn't exist, as though there were no people there. Africa is a great big nothing in terms of history. Just as a little clue there, I was in Kano in the heart of Nigeria one day, and it happened to be one of their celebration days, and there were black men, leaders of Kano, riding horses with coats of mail, you know, linked mail on the horses, and the men were wearing coats of mail armor, just like the old medieval knights of yore, you know, like King Arthur's men. Well, I asked some of the people standing there as this parade went by, I said, you know, where did these come from? Hollywood or something like that? And they said, no, don't you know? And a very fine young man sat me down and told me that hundreds and hundreds of years before, the remnants of a lost crusade, medieval people from Europe had wandered into Africa and were defeated and captured, and that these natives had these original old coats of mail for the horses and for the men. Now, in Nigeria, they never had horses. They wouldn't need coats of mail before. They didn't have horses. Well, this proves that in Africa, way back in the time of the Crusades, there were people strong enough to defeat the Crusaders and also to recognize that the loot they captured from those people were worth keeping as historic evidence. In other words, Africa existed in history. In fact, another thing I learned from this man I was talking with is that their language is the original language of the Rosetta Stone. And the Rosetta Stone, which was used to translate the hieroglyphics of Egypt, had been unfathomable to European scholars until all of a sudden a group of Nigerians traveling in Cairo saw the Rosetta Stone, and although they couldn't read the hieroglyphics, they could read the language on the other side. And they read the language, told the scholars about it, the scholars translated it into English, and then they decoded the hieroglyphics, and that's how they solved the story of the Rosetta Stone. The people from Nigeria had this ancient culture which produced a language which is on the Rosetta Stone, and for centuries nobody could translate the Rosetta Stone, forgetting that the Africans had that history and that culture, and our history books leave them out with a big zero. We don't know anything about Africans in history. Well, this is true even more so, even to a greater degree, when we think about China and India and Indonesia and Southeast Asia. They have ancient history. The history we study through Europe and back to the Middle East runs back, what, 1,000 years before Christ, 2,000 years before Christ. Easily, the history of India and Southeast Asia goes back 11 or 12,000 years. Easily, the history of Indonesia goes back thousands of years. And the history of China is almost limitless. It is quite obvious that the Chinese culture, to include the manufacture of such things as cast iron or the ability to print on paper, go back long before such things were even contemplated by anyone in either the Middle East or in India. For reference, I would recommend everyone read and study the books of Dr. Joseph Needham of Cambridge University in England. There's a whole series of books, and they're absolutely indispensable to an understanding of the true history of man on Earth. Well, one of the interesting things about Needham's work and some of the other studies of the Chinese people in those days was the Chinese had mastered the ability to sail in the oceans as the Portuguese had later on. And the Chinese would follow the coastline down from China, down around Southeast Asia, down around Malaysia, and back up to Burmese coast, across the Bay of Bengal to Calcutta, or down the east coast of India, past Ceylon and around the tip of India and on up to Bombay, and even around to Arabia and East Africa. And the story goes that as the Chinese visited port cities on their trips along, it was like a party. As they pulled into port, they would stand out there and wave banners and hold gifts in their hands. They would sing songs and they would dance. They wouldn't carry firearms. And the people met them the same way. And they were welcome to stay for years or to stay whatever they wanted, and they opened up trade and sailed back and forth between these places until one day they arrived in a certain area of the east coast of Africa, and they were treated with hostility. And they found out that's as far as the Portuguese had gotten, coming around from Portugal, around Africa, and using guns every time they went ashore, burning villages, stealing whatever they wanted. And it showed that the Chinese method of exploration had been a party with official ambassadors, with presents for the local rulers and all. And the Portuguese system was to use guns and shoot the people. So we see quite a difference in these cultures. And this has led even to a better understanding of their overland exploration. The Chinese, having this enormous landmass to their west, had the same interest in exploring the west as we did, wondering how far the west went. And the Chinese actually traveled with ambassadors, official people from their government, in parties of 15 or 20, as far as we understand today, like Baghdad. And there, such parties would meet the leaders of Baghdad. They would talk and understand each other. The Chinese seemed to be very adept at languages. And if they didn't know the language, they would sit down and study it and study everything these people had. And there was a very intriguing story of a party that the rulers of China sent back to Baghdad with a very learned leader and some 15 or 20 scholars with him. And he would sit down and listen to the intelligent people of Baghdad as they explained how they did this, how they did, like arithmetic. The Chinese had not learned the Arabic base for arithmetic or for mathematics that spread all over the world. And the Chinese were taking notes in shorthand. And they would listen and take notes in shorthand, and as fast as the Arabs could talk to them, they'd transcribe it. This had been going on for a while meaning years, when another group of Chinese came and reported that the king or the emperor wanted the first group to come back. For some reason, they had to go back. So by this time, this elderly Chinaman had become good friends with the leader in Baghdad, and he said, look, I have to return to my country, but I know there is much that we haven't finished studying. He said, I would like you to give me 7 of your best scholars, each in their own trade, their own specialty, and ask them to dictate to me from their books. And he said, I want to write it down and take this back to my emperor. And the Arab chief said, you mean you are going to write down what 7 men tell you simultaneously? He said, yes. And he did. And after he had been copying for 3 or 4 hours, the chief stopped those people, and then he asked the Chinaman, this man from section 3 over here, read back what he told you. He turned his pages, read it back perfectly. Okay, this man, number 5, read it back. The Chinaman, without fault, had been taking down the shorthand, listening to 7 people simultaneously. I use the figure 7. It might have been 8 or 10. Dr. Needham tells the story with great thoroughness. What this says is that the Chinese had perfected, and we believe today they retain this even more so than they had in those days, the ability to write a shorthand that could translate simultaneous lectures, not just one, and simultaneously probably to the number of 7, 8, or 9. Dr. Needham gives the exact figure because he has seen it done. What this means is that when you put all these together, their culture, their art, their trading, their ability to make cast iron and bronze, they drilled for oil at 2,000 feet using bamboo pipe, things like that. They were not backward people. This, without any question, puts the Chinese at a level in history certainly equal to, but probably higher than the levels of Europe and the Middle East. Now, when we educate ourselves enough to understand that, and as we've said earlier, when we also understand that leaders of this world recognize a high cabal, I think it is ridiculous, since I myself cannot disbelieve the existence of a high cabal, that the high cabal very probably includes Asians and more probably is led by Asians. Now, I wouldn't argue that. I don't know how to explain it, except if you watch rain fall, you notice it all runs in accordance with gravity. Well, if you study mankind, you notice there is a sort of gravity in the day-to-day world of mankind. And I don't think it is all happenstance. I think that there is direction from, as Churchill says, the high cabal. But I also believe that the high cabal, which can include people from, of course, any region of the world. I don't think they recognize countries. I think the world is just the world for those people. And I believe that it would be strongly manned with Chinese, or even probably led by Chinese.
Fascinating. This last thing, we have about 20 minutes here.